Well, Jervois Mining is revamping or ramping up its operations, agreeing to acquire 100% of a nickel and cobalt refinery in Brazil. The $22.5 million deal is the first in the country for Jervois. And to tell us more about the deal is Executive Bryce Crocker. Bryce, pleasure to have you on the program. Big deal. The stock market likes it. Just talk us through the implications of this.
Thanks, Ingrid. Yeah, we're excited. We had an investor call earlier today, and I hope we kind of conveyed our enthusiasm. So there were two announcements. We announced the results of a Bankable Feasibility Study for what will be the only cobalt mine in the United States when it comes into operation in 2022 in Idaho. And we also, as you noted, announced the acquisition of a cobalt refinery, nickel cobalt refinery, São Miguel Paulista in São Paulo in Brazil. So what the refinery does is it provides us an opportunity to take the concentrate from the mine and then take that down to Brazil, convert to final product and sit down with OEMs, battery manufacturers, OEMs in the context of auto companies, and really deliver them final product that they require for their customer usage.
Strategy then with this particular thing, with this particular acquisition, the next step, the timeline, I guess.
So we're working with financiers now. We're moving forwards with a position to really look for debt financing by the end of the year. So the timeline in Idaho was with regard to, we finished the feasibility study that was released today, finalised financing by the end of the year, long lead order items, and then we're moving forwards into construction on site in May 2021 with a view to start production in mid-2022. In terms of Brazil, it's a staggered entry in terms of the structure of the consideration. We start a feasibility study shortly with a view that we will then finalise that feasibility study. If the refinery turns on at the same time as the mine in mid-2022, basis the concentrate, then that will be obviously the time. We're looking at ways that we can accelerate that by talking to third-party suppliers of nickel intermediates and cobalt intermediates to accelerate the timing.
I guess give us an idea of the metrics, or at least the dynamics of the cobalt and nickel market, why you like it going forward.
I think, on the nickel market, I think someone far more eloquent than I, Elon, gave a presentation earlier in the week where they spoke around what it actually means, the electric vehicle revolution. So obviously the critical part of the cathode for electric vehicles is nickel and cobalt. To put it in context, for the amount of nickel in the global market today, ballpark, say 2.5 million tonnes. If you back solve the forecast that Tesla have for just Tesla's consumption for nickel in 2030, 1 million tonnes, which is 40% of the global market today for just one company. So just profound numbers that are going to be needed on the nickel side. Cobalt it's a difficult commodity. 3/4 of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Obviously politically unstable, challenging work practices in the case of many non-industrial producers in that part of the world. And so having 3/4 of the cobalt supply coming out of the DRC, around 85% of that 3/4 then goes into China. China's really deployed and set itself up within the DRC to dominate supply. And part of what we're looking to create at Jervois is a solution that enables automakers in Europe, Japan, and obviously the United States, where I'm currently based, to provide a solution that gives them confidence and continuity of supply of units that really enables them as the electrification transforms the global auto industry. The criticality of the metal units that are going to support that move away from fossil fuels. Ultimately, that needs to be stable and confident and secured in a manner which obviously has the social and environmental implications that we want.
With that in mind, I guess, how important is cost control in giving you a competitive advantage, and how do you go about keeping costs under wraps?
I think the cost of for us on the mining side, it's about low capital costs. So how can we build something? Obviously, the costs are profound on the mining side. So how can you come in and build something for relatively low capital and generate the required economic returns? I think the more important part of cost in terms of the nickel cobalt space is really on the customer side. So they've got this criticality. Obviously, the battery is clearly a fundamentally important part of an electric vehicle. It goes without saying. And customers are focused on costs, but they're also focused on other requirements. So where does it come from? How is it mined? What's the environmental footprint of it being mined? And is it something that ultimately is appropriate to be placing in electric vehicles as we transition from fossil fuels? And that's really where the Idaho Cobalt Operations comes into its own. It will be the only cobalt mine in the United States for what the US government has identified as a critical raw material. And the opportunity to come into production and to provide stable sources of supply proximate to end-use markets in a jurisdiction which is obviously very politically stable. And from a trading perspective, the United States is probably the most important cobalt market in the world, just given the importance not only for electric vehicles, but also its consumption into aerospace. So cost is important, but as some of the headlines associated with the DRC would suggest, it's not just cost, and consumers aren't just looking for just cost. It's really performance. I mean, if you look at an electric vehicle, there's really three criterion. It's range, it's speed, and it's safety. Cobalt's critical for the safety. Nickel is critical for the former two attributes.
COVID threw some spanners in the works, well, for everyone, but also for you when it comes to some of the drilling that you planned in Uganda that looks to be back on track now. Are there any sort of lasting ramifications that have come from the uncertainty in COVID, which is really still in play?
No, I mean, it's still there. It's, obviously, I'm in the United States, and it's affected our ability to mobilise and travel from Australia. But in terms of Jervois, I would never suggest that the global pandemic is, clearly it's been, a terrible year. 2020 is a year we'll all rather kind of park behind us. But I think that what it does provide, we can build a mine safely within the pandemic in the United States. M3, our engineering contractor, none of their construction projects have shut down during the pandemic. We work outside, we work with appropriate policies and procedures, we work with appropriate PPE, and so we can build the mine physically within the United States during the pandemic. Clearly the international travel, the biggest impact was probably commercially initially. When in March the pandemic arrived and I was in Australia, and typically I don't spend a lot of time in Australia. I'm going to Japan and South Korea and other countries. But I think in many ways, there's been a cultural transition. If you'd said to me 12 months ago that I'd be negotiating with Japanese and South Korean companies across Zoom calls, I would have said that's culturally impossible. That's never going to happen. But you know what? People have adjusted. It's not perfect, but I think that we're in a position now where capital markets, obviously there's clearly the sentiment around Tesla and others and electrification. There's strong enthusiasm there. And we're not back to normal, but we're back to a position where we're just excited to be moving forwards with financing. Ours is a small project, but at the end of the day, it's 200 jobs, direct jobs in the United States for construction, 180 during operations. 85% of the $78 million we'll spend will be United States source manufacturing equipment. The multiplier effect of that's 3 times. So anything you can do, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere in the world, to create jobs and economic growth, whilst obviously the economy everywhere has been so hard hit, is very important.
Well, the market loved your announcement today, Bryce. We really appreciate you coming on AusBiz to tell us all about it. Thank you.
No problems, Ingrid. Thanks. Appreciate the invitation. Thank you.